In this lesson we'll be looking at our constraint in the sketching environment. We will then see our variables and how to insert variables and modify them, and then we'll be moving on to create a series of basic rings and see how easy it is to build up a vast library of your own designs. So let's start off on the constraints. We're going to create a new file, the normal generic template. Let's name our part. Okay, and we're going to start by creating a sketch straight away. So right click, insert sketch, let's place it on the top datum, use central define by plane, confirm. Now we have been through our drawing tools in the sketching environment, and we've briefly touched upon and used our constraints and our quick dimensions, but now we're going to take a closer look at our tools in this ribbon panel, our constraint ribbon panel. Okay, so let's start off by sketching a series of 2-point lines. Here you can see some of these auto constraints that are thrown in using our smart picking, our snap filter. I'm just going to erase these for now. Okay, so constraints force conditions on our geometry, and these are our various constraints here. Okay, we have a list of all these constraints that we can add to our sketch. So let's use some. We'll use our point coincident constraint, where we will pick one point and then we can pick multiple other points. Okay, and when we confirm the operation, these 2 points are going to be constrained to one another, and this blue dot at the intersection of these 2 points, at the meeting point, signifies that they have a point coincident constraint attached to them. Okay, so when I try moving these around, they're going to stay joined at that point. Like so. Okay, we can also add perpendicular constraints. Okay, there's many here. I'm just going to touch on a few of them now. Perpendicular. Pick a line, curves. Okay, and we add a perpendicular constraint to this meeting point of these 2 curves. So when we try to move them about, you can see they stay perpendicular. We have this perpendicular constraint on there, and they will remain perpendicular until we erase this constraint, which we can simply do by selecting it and pressing delete or our erase button. Okay, so let's add some more constraints. We're going to create a rectangle. Let's constrain these two to be parallel. We can constrain them to be an equal length. Okay, so these are going to remain parallel and an equal length. Point coincident, middle click. Okay, now let's throw in a horizontal constraint. So we now have a rectangle. Let's constrain it to a point in space. I want to constrain the middle of this line to the origin. We use our point to midpoint constraint. Pick 2 points, then we pick a point for the midpoint of these 2 points to be locked onto. Okay, so here is a constrained rectangle. We have constraints added to it. But this is not yet what we call fully constrained. We're still able to drag it around and change its shape. Okay, but we can now add dimensions to our rectangle to fully constrain it. So these are our dimensions. Okay, we've been using our quick dimension tool, okay, to place these dimensions in our sketching environment. So let's use our linear dimension tool. Left click. Okay, I want to dimension this line. When I let my cursor hover over it, it's going to snap to one endpoint. Okay, I left click. Okay, and then when I hover my cursor over the line again, it's going to snap to the other endpoint. Left click, and now I can drag out the dimension text. Okay, and I can dimension within here, and you'll see when I try to drag my rectangle, that top edge is now locked in to be that dimension. I can't change it. Okay, so let's add a final dimension to this side. Okay, now in our options panel, for here we use a horizontal dimension method. We're going to need to switch it to the vertical. Okay, now you can see we are fully constrained. Okay, we cannot drag this rectangle out anywhere. Okay, and to check the constraint status of our sketch, we can use our Constraint Status command. Okay, when we left click on this, it's going to bring up some colors on our sketch and also our color bar on the left hand side. Okay, so each color signifies a certain constraint status. Okay, an entirely green sketch means it is a well-defined sketch. Okay, it is fully constrained. Okay, let's say we delete our dimensions. Do our constraint status again. We see it's blue. It's underdefined. We are missing dimensions. Okay. Okay, now we can also use our auto constrain tool to throw in auto constraints on our geometry. So it's going to analyze the sketch geometry and add constraints and dimensions automatically to it. So if we left click, we need to pick a base point. Let's say our base point is the origin. Then we can pick the entities that we want to auto constrain. Okay, there are other options. We can choose which constraints we want to use, which dimensions have priority. Okay, let's confirm the operation, and you see our dimensions are automatically thrown in to have a fully constrained sketch. Okay, so the auto constrain will fully constrain our sketch geometry. Okay, so let's erase all of our dimensions and all of our constraints. I'll set my pick filter to only recognize our dimensions and constraints. Do a window pick, delete. Okay, and we have our rectangle left, which can be broken up when we drag our curves. Okay, so now we can use our auto constrain. Let's first check our constraint. Okay, it's remained black. This means it is unconstrained. We have no constraints whatsoever or dimensions on this sketch. Let's auto constrain it. Base point, entities, I'll do a chain pick, confirm. There we go, we have our auto constrain to fully constrain our sketch. Now what happens if we add in too many constraints? How about we try to add another point to midpoint constraint? When we try to do this, it's going to show that we have an overdefined and over-constrained sketch. Okay, we cannot add that point to midpoint because we already have a well-defined, a fully constrained sketch. So we can work with under-constrained, over-constrained, or well-constrained geometry in our sketches. ZW doesn't discriminate, but the preference may be to work with well-constrained sketches. We might be able to rely on these better when we are making changes, and generally speaking they may be considered a better sketch, okay, but not always. So I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to redraw some of our lines. Okay, so we've seen before our smart picking snaps. They'll throw in auto constraints, okay, and this can help us constrain our geometry faster. Okay, also, let me just erase this and draw our 4 2-point lines again. Okay, I'll take out this constraint. We have our add constraints command, and this is going to allow us to place these constraints in a more dynamic fashion. Okay, so when we left click on here, we're taking into our add constraints input manager, and now depending on what we pick, what entities or points we pick, we're going to get the options of constraints we can use. So let's pick left click 2 endpoints, and here you can see we can add these constraints. We want to add this constraint, point to point constraint, point coincidence constraint, confirm. Okay, so it's going to be quicker, like this. Now we can add our perpendicular constraints. Parallel. Okay, horizontal. Same length. Okay, if you don't know what these constraints do, let your mouse cursor hover over it for a second and you'll see the name for that constraint. Pick two endpoints. Midpoint. Point to midpoint constraint. Okay, and then we also have our quick dimension tool that we've seen before. Okay, so this is a similar concept to our add constraints command. Our quick dimension command allows us to apply these dimensions dynamically. Okay, we can pick our line. Okay, now we have a fully constrained sketch. Okay, so our dimensions. Seen before, we have our linear dimensions, angular, we have radial dimensions, arc dimensions, and we can use our quick dimensions tool to make applying them much faster. Now we can modify our dimensions. We've seen by double clicking on them or right click, modify value. Okay, we're taking into this options panel here. We can make modifications to our dimensions. Now we have two icons to the right. We can select a variable. We can assign a variable to our dimension. We can create a variable and then assign that value to equal that of the dimension here. Then we can modify with the variable in our part level. Okay, we're going to see this in the next part of the lesson. This icon here, select dimension, allows us to constrain this dimension to be equal to that of another dimension. So if we left click here, pick another dimension, we'll see that dimension name be thrown into our box. Okay, now that dimension is constrained to be the same length as this one, the same value as this one. So when we modify it, both of them are going to modify. Okay, we have a square. Okay, so both of these tools, these methods of dimensioning, we'll be using later on in this lesson. Okay, so one last thing to look at is in our document aware toolbar, we have toggles for our dimensions, our constraints, and our color code, our constraint status color coding. Okay, so we can toggle on and off our dimensions, we can toggle on and off our constraints, and we can toggle on and off this color coding. Okay, so when we playing around in our sketch, we can always see the constraint status of our sketch. Okay, so these are our constraints and dimensions in the sketching environment.